It's 3:30 on a Wednesday, so you know what that means. Thank you for joining us for our second political communication job talk. Today and tomorrow we are hosting Dr. Bridget Barrett from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she is an assistant professor of advertising in the College of Media, Communication, and Information. As Bridget characterizes her research, her past work examined how commercial technology platforms design their products and make rules that promote democratic goods or exacerbate democratic life. Shifting from this area, her current and future research focuses on social identity and the intersection of consumerism and politics. Relatedly, she is deeply interested in how people understand what political parties are. In other words, are there coherent, common constructs of each party across the US population? Bridget earned her bachelor's in advertising and political science from the University of Oregon, after which she worked in industry as a programmatic analyst at Spark Foundry, a digital media manager for, I'm going to pronounce it Liquidus.
Liquidus, but it's a weird name.
Okay.
Tech companies.
Marketing, and a senior automated buyer at Brill Media. She returned to academia to earn her MA and PhD in Media and Communication at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Bridget has published half a dozen referee journal articles in the Internet Policy Review, the Ohio State, we have to say the Ohio State, but it's not, Ohio State Technology Law Journal, Journal of Information Technology and Politics, Policy and Internet, and Information Communication Society. And of course, we know her political communication article from her application packet. Bridget also has a forthcoming chapter in the SAGE Handbook of Political Marketing, as well as a number of academic research reports and pieces in the popular press. So please join us this afternoon in welcoming Dr. Bridget Barrett for her research talk, Platforms, Identity, and Cultural Constructs, Frontiers in Political Advertising Research. The floor is all yours, Bridget.
Thank you.
We love a long title. We got to get all the keywords in there, you know. Thank you all for coming today. It's really great to see so many people in the room. You never know how many folks are going to show up, and it's just a testimony to this department to see that people are so engaged and are actually here, and so I really do appreciate you being here. So, hi, I'm Bridget. Today I'm going to talk, first I'm just going to give you a little bit of theoretical positioning, right? Some ways to place me, who I am, the work I do, people that I really like, whose work I respect. And then I'm going to talk about my work on political advertising through 3 articles that I've published or that are in the publication process. Through those articles, I'm going to talk about the reasons why I'm interested in political advertising, talking about technology and political ads, right? The rise of platforms right now. Then I'm going to talk about effects of political ads, what I call instrumental effects, something that I'm trying to bring attention to in the literature. And finally, I'm going to talk about ad content and political identity. Then I'm going to move into talking about some current and future work, things that I am doing now. So with that, let's get started. So some of the work that I love are things like the hybrid media system by Andrew Chadwick, looking at how media changes and how it interacts with broader systems. Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason. Is anyone in the room familiar with this one? Okay, this is much more of like a political science book. This is all about social sorting, polarization, and when we say social sorting, it's how different identity groups are being sorted in political parties in the United States. And finally, The Propagandist Playbook by Francesca Bola Tripodi. She's a sociologist who got hired in iSchool and publishes all in comm journals. So just very cool work on the strategic use of new technology by various actors. So I'm interested in the importance of political identity in a sorted electorate here in the United States. I'm interested in how technological change impacts other systems. And I'm interested in the strategic use of new technology. I do come from a professional background in advertising, and I specifically worked with the data to deliver ads to people. So if you've ever had the boots that follow you around the internet, that's the kind of work that I did, putting ads online and on social media, dealing with the data and systems that get those ads in front of the right people at the right time. The big idea that I'm going to talk about as I go through this presentation and that is driving my future work, whoa, what is this? Y'all, that skipped like really far ahead. Okay, so when we have technological and political change, we should look for new kinds of effects from political communication. And now, I say new, and I put it on there like this big new idea. It isn't going to be new. It's going to be the same thing that people have been doing forever, because very rarely are things new. But I'm going to talk about it in a different way and talk about methods that we can bring to bear on these questions. So, political advertising. Why political advertising? Why do I study political advertising if I'm interested in these things? First of all, it's a massive industry, over $12 billion spent on political ads in 2024, over $1.3 billion of that spent on just Meta and Google, so these being two major ad platforms, but not even all of it, right? We have lots of other ad platforms as well. And a major way that people encounter politics and political information. A lot of people in this room, I suspect, are politically engaged. I suspect you probably follow the news, read the news, and things like that. For people who don't do that, when they're at home on a Sunday watching football, they get political ads, right? So this is a way that people encounter politics, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. The other reason I'm interested in it comes from my background working in the systems that deliver ads. It's intellectually interesting because of its embeddedness in cultural logic, media technologies, and political systems, right? That I don't want to take the ads out of these things. They are embedded in all of these things, and we can learn about these things through the ads, and we can learn about the ads through the culture and the political systems and the media technologies. All right, with that framework, we're going to go through these 3 papers that I published on political advertising and with these big ideas in mind. So the first one is my solo published piece in Political Communication, Commercial Companies and Party Networks, Digital Advertising Firms in U.S. Elections from 2006 to 2016. Background on this. Parties in the United States are not extremely formal structures, right? They don't have clear leaders all the time. They are often thought of as extended networks. A decentralized structure, but still a structure. We don't have designated party leaders. You have a lot of people working towards various goals that come together as a political party. In this decentralized structure, you have consultants who often provide infrastructural support, but they also have these very identifiable impacts on the strategies of campaigns. And more recent work has found Facebook and Google acting as political consultants, has had these tech companies actually having identifiable impacts on campaigns. And so, okay. So I was curious what types of companies that political campaigns and committees hire for digital advertising. I was interested in what the structure of the network is, of who is being hired and by whom, and who the most central members of those networks were, and if this has changed over time. Oh no. Y'all, this thing is this is just black now. Cool, great, we're good. So methods. What made sense for this was a network analysis. So what I did is I pulled data from the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission requires that political committees, so anyone who's trying to influence an election or a ballot initiative at a federal level, that they submit reports of what they spent their money on and who they hired to do work for them. And so then you can go and download that data and see, okay, who did this hiring, what is the political committee that did this hiring, and who is the company that they paid for what. These are called this is a two-mode sociocentric network. What this means when I say two-mode, it just means that there are 2 types of things in the network. The 2 types of things are committees and companies. So political committees might be something like Obama for America or the Sierra Club. Has anyone given money to a political committee recently that might show up in something like this? Yeah, Katie, give us the name. You don't have to give us a name, Katie. And then examples of companies might be a Facebook or a Google, but this could also be a revolutionary messaging, a targeted victory, right? These are companies, those are consultancies in this space. So we're gonna look at some networks here, and I'm gonna explain what's going on in them. hopefully, we're gonna look at some networks here. And maybe someday, there we go. All right, so to start, I want to look at it. This says 2008, so these were between 2006 and up to 2008, companies that were hired by political committees. So in these graphs here, we have the little black circles, we call those nodes in network analysis, and those are our political committees. And those transparent circles, those are our companies. Now, does anyone know what Democratic political committee would be in the center of here in 2008? Anyone who history?
Move on.
This one's actually Obama for America. This one's OFA. Yeah, so we have Obama for America, and here we have this company here is Google, where you start to see people hiring Google. Over here on the Republican side, you have Google here. And then in 2012, we have a lot more going on. And we start to have here, okay, great. Google and Facebook are our little white transparent nodes here, and Google and Facebook also showing up on the Republican side, as well as a company called Audience Partners, which was a major consultancy as well. And then finally, in 2016, this actually got so complicated that in order to even look at this in any way, I had to remove some of the nodes to start to see them. But the same pictures here, you have Google, you have Facebook, you also have Rising Tide Interactive, which is a major consultancy, and then whoop, Targeted Victory, Google, and Facebook on the right. Oh my Lord, okay, I am gonna just, can't hold this against me, y'all. I might have to give up on this thing. I think I'm gonna, no, I'm doing it manually from here on out. Okay, so we have an increased role of Facebook and Google in these networks over time. As well, and I want to talk about why that matters, but I also want to call out that one of the other things that I did is I categorized what type of companies all of these were that were being hired, and found that 1 in 10 companies in these networks had no political specialization. It was about 1 in 4 relationships. And so this is kind of over time, 2008, 2012, 2016, and you see commercial agencies being hired about, or 12.6% of the things hired in 2016 were commercial agencies, and that was about 1 in 4 relationships. So why do we care? What matters about this? The big thing that we care about is when we think about the diffusion of innovation. If we know that consultants are influencing these networks, if we know that they're passing along knowledge and strategies, this has implications for it. For one, it means that we do have a lot of outside influence. We do have these commercial agencies in the mix. But probably more importantly, we know that Facebook and Google are going to be the ones establishing norms in digital advertising. And that it's a pretty straightforward jump to say that we can expect them to influence how political digital advertising works, what the content is going to be, and who receives it. And recognizing this, asking, how do these systems influence these things? Coming as someone who worked in programmatic media buying, who used these systems to put ads out there, the way that the systems works influences what your content is. Sometimes in really simple ways, this isn't in my research, but just things like there used to be a rule on Facebook that the image couldn't be more than 20% text. It's a small rule, but it does have implications, right? If you talk to anyone who studies visuals and experiments and things like that, like these do mean things. So kind of a call of like, okay, we know that this would have some type of influence. What type of influence might it have? This was just accepted at Social Media Society, no better than soup, ? Important question mark there, which I'll explain in a second. Comparing null experimental effects of political Facebook ads across persuasive and instrumental measures of effectiveness. So in this piece, I was interested, with my co-author Shannon McGregor, in these instrumental measures. So research into political messaging online has looked for effects on turnout. That's our big one, right? Turnout or vote choice. Are people going to show up after they see a political ad? How many political ads does it take for someone to show up? Infinite, so many small effects. Or favorability in other attitudes. But missing from this literature is donations and list building. Now, why this is missing from this literature is because donations and list building aren't the things that political scientists really care about, right? They're not changing your vote choice, they're not changing your turnout, they're not affecting your institutions or your behaviors and things like that. But content analyses of political ads have started to find that online about 50% of them are just about donation or list building. So we wanted to look into this and call attention to this. So we talk about these different types of ads as persuasion versus instrumental. So instrumental comes from public opinion researcher Susan Herbst, who talks about public opinion data for instrumental purposes, like saying we're like using the data from public opinion research for these instrumental purposes. And so we take that and say, okay, well, we're going to talk about instrumental effects of digital ads, these donations and list buildings. So what we wanted to know was if we could find effects of these types of ads, if persuasion ads also had effects on list building or donation. And what we're really interested in is if these are the same thing or not. Like if these ads do the same things, if people interpret them in the same way, if people who give money are the same people who have different favorability ratings, right? Like looking at that. So we did a between subjects online survey experiment. We had 3 treatments for Republicans, 3 treatments for Democrats. And these treatments were a persuasion ad. I'm going to show examples of these. Persuasion ads, acquisition ads, that being list building, getting email addresses, getting contact information, and fundraising ads, asking for money. And we had a control condition. Our dependent variables were set up to understand these, what we call persuasion versus instrumental outcomes. And we, tested for differences with ANOVAs in these experiments, which were all null results. But more importantly, we used a principal component analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute. So our treatment examples, these are what donation ads look like on Facebook. And these, we pulled actual ads from the Trump and Biden campaigns. So these were things that ran, that had lots of impressions, and that were kind of easily categorizable into these mostly by the goals. So on Facebook, you have an option to put a call to action button. We call this a call to action button. And so for donation, it's like the donate now button. Pretty straightforward. And we had 3 different donation versions. For each of these, there weren't differences between them when we tested for those. So we had 3 from Joe Biden, 3 from Donald Trump. Our persuasion ads were ones that either had no call to action button or had a learn more button. These were ones that looked like they were about this vote choice issue, right? These are trying to convince people that this is the best person for the job here. And then we had our data acquisition ads. Take the official approval poll, yes or no. How should Joe approach his first debate against Trump? Let us know. So these are these sign up, these polls, that the goal of them ends up being to get an email address, right? You can't submit your answer. I assume a lot of you know this, but you don't get to include your answer unless you give your email address, or your phone number. So this is a way that these groups get more email address and phone numbers in order to send those endless texts. And then we had a control condition. Can anyone guess what our control condition was? It's in the title. It was a can of Progresso noodle soup. I don't remember why we chose this. I have no idea. But that was our control condition. And we asked people after they were exposed to these ads and had to spend a minute on that page about favorability, about their vote choice, about their vote intent, all of these coming from your typical ad experiments, as well as these instrumental outcomes, asking about if they would give an email address or phone number, asking if they would donate, how much they would donate, and if they would respond to a survey. So the answer to the if there are differences in treatments is in the title, right? This was a fairly small sample for ad effects, so we had null results across all of our experimental conditions. That is not interesting on the persuasion outcomes because we knew that this was going to be hard to find a difference. But it was interesting in the instrumental outcomes because no one had done it before, so we didn't know if you would find anything. And so the answer was like, no, we still don't find anything. You need a larger sample, basically. Just not like, yeah. But what we're interested in is doing a principal component analysis on these dependent variables. So looking at what people said for all of these, thinking about, if you're not familiar with principal component analysis, it's a factor analysis. It's a way to do what goes with what. It's a way to see what hangs together. And you're trying to explain variance in your data by taking like a model that explains the most, and then the next component is whatever explains the rest of the as much of the underlying variance as possible, and so on. And so we ran this, and yeah. And the important thing to know is when you're looking at a PCA result, you're looking at these loadings on the components, and you're looking to see if there are clear differences in these loadings on components. So in this one, it was pretty straightforward that we saw all of our instrumental results, like we can say they hung together, right? That these were all a similar thing, and our feeling, thermometer, favorability were something else. So it was a way of saying, like, these are two separate things. These are conceptually and operationally two different things that we might want to be looking at. So the biggest contribution here was just like, articulating a thing, instrumental effects, calling it something, and saying, like, we all know that this exists. We all get these, right? We all see these, but this is something that's currently understudied in the literature. I think we found one paper that dealt with fundraising in our review of the literature, and it was one case. And so currently researchers aren't testing for these instrumental effects. So it was like, we should probably do this. This is an effect that is coming from a development in technology. So the ability to send these messages to folks, the ability to collect this data very easily, online payment systems that allow people to go and pay this money has changed how political advertisers advertise. It's changed their goals. With technological change, we see new effects. All right, ad content and political identity. So this piece, Pistols and Pearls, Textual Analysis of Woman versus Woman, US 2022 Gubernatorial Political Advertisements. This was in the top paper panel at the National Communications Association back in November, and I currently have an R&R in progress in Communication and Democracy, which is the journal of the NCA Political Communication Division. Gender disparities persist at all levels of elected office in the United States. The majority of elected women leaders are Democrats. At the federal level, it's about 70 to 75%, depending on the year. And the majority of elected women leaders are white. All of Republican elected women in federal office are white. Now, early work in looking at gender and campaign strategy found differences between genders, like they were able to say, like, oh, look, we have a feminine style. But that's basically wiped out recently. That more recent work that looks at comparisons about how men and women communicate on the campaign trail, it's really hard to find differences in how men and women communicate. So in 2022, a record 5 states had woman versus woman gubernatorial contests. These were Oregon, Arizona, Alabama, Iowa, and Michigan. When I say a record of 5 states, I really want to communicate how much of a record that was. Before 2022, how many times do you think, does anyone know how many times there were woman versus woman races for governor of the United States? The history of the United States.
0.
Not 0, not 0. It was 4. It was 4. So over the history of the United States, this had only happened 4 times in the hundreds of years that we've existed as a country. So when we saw 5, right, this is more than had ever happened in the history before this. That makes it interesting. This is a change. We are seeing a change. My co-authors and I were like, okay, if we see a change and something happening, maybe we should look more closely at it. And so our big research question going into this was just, when we remove men, what can we learn? Like, if we take them out, like, what do we see? Can we see anything? At an executive office, like, we just haven't had this opportunity before. But more specifically, we were looking at conventional notions of masculinity and femininity We were trying to understand gender, race, and other sociocultural power dynamics. And we were really looking at this by party as well, looking at what the party differences or similarities were. Okay. The methods for this, we decided to do a textual analysis. A lot of studies in political communication on ads are content or like quantitative content analyses, and we decided not to take that route. We wanted to be able to have a more nuanced understanding, focus on the meaning and context of the language as well as the visuals. And we wanted to try to have a more flexible and adaptive approach to our data analysis. Content analysis requires a very predetermined code book, and we didn't want that. So we selected 82 ads across these 5 races. These were from YouTube pages, Google's Transparency Center, Facebook Ad Library, and online searches for additional ads. This is very much a proposa sample. This was looking for ads that had novel content so that we weren't just seeing the same thing over and over again. We did make what's called a living code book, and so this we put on all the different content analyses of political ads. We wrote all those down. We made sure we were looking for those too, so that we could take those into account when we were doing our own thematic coding. And so we did initial coding, focus coding, and thematic coding, and that initial coding we all did individually. So after we did our readings on these candidates and these states, these races, then we all did our own coding there before coming back together with theoretical memoing and consensus building. Most interesting findings. There is a lot of this that is just like confirming recent quantitative work when we talk about it. The women are people too, and they also do things that you would expect men to do. And so this is where we don't see that many big differences in men versus women contests. It was a lot of like, yeah, women are not just feminine. Like sometimes we do masculine things too. We don't just present ourselves with children. So there's a decent bit of that in our findings. The other piece that I want to talk more about is political identity as constraining self-presentation, and really with a focus on how Democratic women had more flexibility. You saw more ways that they expressed their femininity and their masculinity compared to Republican women who were fitting into a narrower or had more seeming constraints. So here are 2 short-haired women running for governor. They're both wearing blazers. That's about where the similarities end, right? So you have Carrie Lake here, the election denier who is running for governor in Arizona. One thing that we see, this is common across many women, every Republican woman wore pearls in at least one of her ads, if not all of them. The Republican women often used contouring in their makeup, so this is making your face fit a feminine standard by changing the dimensions of it using makeup. And we also see here Tina Kotek, the now governor of Oregon, does not wear jewelry. She wears thick-rimmed glasses. Glasses, apparently, that's a difference. No contouring, minimalist makeup or more masculine makeup. And I can't really speak to the naturalness of hair here, but that was something that we would love to talk more about. We also have, so up top, we have Gretchen Whitmer and Tudor Dixon. These were the candidates for governor of Michigan, and we have Katie Hobbs and Carrie Lake here. So talking about the self-presentation aligning with party identity, you have family, you have pearls for Republican women. For Democratic women, you just have, when I say more flexibility, it's that sometimes they did present themselves in very traditional ways, and then sometimes they didn't, right? That they had these options of how to present themselves that you don't see as much among the Republican women. And you have elements of what's called identity ownership. This is Shannon McGregor, Daniel Crease, and Regina Lawrence wrote a piece about this, talking not just about how political parties try to own issues, but how they try to own identities. So here we have Kim Reynolds versus Deidre DeJure up top. This is Iowa. So this is a Kim Reynolds ad. Did anyone hear about this ad? This one got some airtime. Okay. So this is a Kim Reynolds ad. Republican woman, incumbent. So so already governor. And this is Cori Bush here, who appears in her ad. And she looks at the screen, and Cori Bush says something about policing, and Kim Reynolds turns to the camera and says, like, sometimes it feels like the whole world's gone crazy, but not in Iowa. So Kim Reynolds was running against Deidre DeJure, a black woman. Does anyone know where Cori Bush is from? I'll give you a hint, it's not Iowa. No. She's a House representative in Missouri, representing Missouri. So this, we talk about how these Republican women, well, both parties want to try to own different identities, right? And the identities that Republicans want to position with are white and Christian. And the identities that Democrats want to position with are more expansive than that. So here you have Deidre DeJure. This is a very common thing in Democratic ads where you have your candidates off with these different interest groups. So there's one of Gretchen Whitmer, like at a pride parade with a pride sticker on her face, you know, really going hard on that. And here you have Deidre talking to a person of color in a wheelchair. Kay Ivey, in her ads, banned critical race theory. Kay Ivey only ever shows white people in her ads. It is entirely white people always, versus the woman she was running against, Yolanda Flowers, who's often positioning herself with many people of color. This is another fairly confirmatory piece. This is something that folks know is happening, but this is also something that is not used in quantitative content analyses of political ads. So part of how we want to talk about this is in the language of authenticity, contributing to literature on the partisan gap and the double bind that women are in by talking about one mechanism that might be there is authenticity. Expectation consistency is one dimension of authenticity. So if people have expectations of what a woman is, it might be harder to reach that expectation consistency. And why I like this and why I want to talk about this is because you're not very often going to get people to say, I don't want to vote for her because I don't think a woman should be a leader. But you might have somebody who say, I just don't think she's very authentic. And so thinking about how we can talk about these things in ways or get to the root of these things using this concept of authenticity. Big picture also, representation matters for democracy. So the other reason why we're interested in this is that we see Republican women facing constraints in how they present themselves, these incredibly driven women, right, who are doing this because they want to make a difference. And it's going to be hard to reach equal representation in government when one party has so much trouble bringing women into the fold. This also has inspired 2 more research ideas. So if you need a thing to talk to me about sometime, you can ask me about that. All right, so what type of effects should we be looking for from political communication? So this is the idea that when we have technological change, when we have cultural change, when we have political change, that maybe we should be thinking about, okay, what should we be looking for? Is there something else that folks might be doing? And I'm interested in measuring cultural constructs and how they change in people's understandings of them. What I love about academia and theory is that you have a lot of people who are often talking about the same things by other words. So when I say cultural constructs, that's something that you might hear in anthropology or sociology, maybe communication sometimes, but you also might be more familiar with social identity theory and the idea of a prototype, that there is a prototype that when people identify with a group, what that group is in their heads is this one thing, this one prototype. Or if you come from strategic communication or marketing and you're thinking about branding, it might be like, oh, okay, how do we control the brand? How do we craft a brand identity so then all the people out there understand it? And what we're talking about is culture, right? That's what we're talking about. So one of the projects that I am beginning work on is using cultural consensus analysis to understand social identities. So thinking about how people understand what it means to be these different things and what these different things are. Okay, I haven't moved the slides around. So one of these things is like, is there consensus on what it means to be a Democrat? Do people have the same idea of Democrat in their heads? The answer is almost certainly no, right? I think pretty quickly we can say that it's unlikely that everyone in the United States agrees on what a Democrat or a Republican is. But I wanna dig into that. So cultural consensus analysis is a way of combining deep qualitative work to then create measures that you can turn into a quantitative way of asking questions. So usually this starts with in-depth interviews, and then having whatever the kind of elements of a construct that people bring up, having folks kind of sort them to start to see how people categorize these different elements, using that, creating survey items for measuring a cultural construct. And once you do that, you can both say, like, is there consensus, right? Do people agree here? And if there is some sense of consensus, if you have something that people agree on or enough people agree on, you can start scoring folks for their cultural competency. You can start asking them questions to see, like, okay, how do they rank on this? You can then use that as a predictor, or you can use it to test for differences in between groups. Why I'm interested in this right now. The two political parties in the United States are at near parity, and people are pretty bought in, right? Folks are very much, not many people are switching parties anymore. So when you have this really stiff and calcified system, what a lot of the messaging, I believe, becomes is about trying to make meaning of what those things are, trying to define what these things are, and hold control over that. And so now that we have this highly sorted and polarized electorate, I would like to start to see how folks are trying to change what it means to be these things, and then how media influences this. All right. The other kind of research area that I have is in political consumerism. So my dissertation, Merchandising Democracy, examined who bought merch, why, and what the overarching branding of political identities were based on merchandise websites in 2022. So this included an online survey, analysis of the 3 most popular merch websites on the right and left, and interviews with official and unofficial sellers of online merch, as well as my big theory chapter. PhD students in the room, raise your hand. Who do we have here? All right, yeah, so it's fun to have a big theory chapter, all right? It's just to work through ideas. And that's where, in that big theory chapter, is where I was working through these ideas of measuring cultural constructs, of what it means to be trying to influence these things, merging branding and social identity theory as these two very complementary theories. And so that has inspired a lot of my work going forward. Also, the fun thing about this dissertation is just how wild the political merchandise is on the internet. So these are like top sellers on some of the most popular sites. And if you can't read this here, this says trust the government. There's so much in this. Yeah, and in all of these. No one's treading on you, sweetie. Masculinity is what you make it. I study trigonometry. All right. So those are some of the pieces that I'm still working on. And then I'm doing a collaboration with Chris Vargo at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's a computational scholar. His work is mostly in advertising and a lot of agenda setting work. He did a lot of agenda setting between like Twitter and news organizations. And so he and I are working as part of a bigger project with a lot of folks in our college. We ran a YouGov panel survey. So lots of questions that people interested in politics and things are interested in. But what Chris and I are excited about is that we also paid to get the trace data of ad exposure from the month before folks took this survey. So what we have is a extremely ungainly and complicated data set that we have to start to figure out how to work with. But what we are interested in is if we think of these ads that people are getting online as kind of the market's rearticulation of their taste, how and if we see differences between party members in their advertising data. This was submitted as work in progress to the International Communication Association. So I'm so excited that if I get in and I see you all there, for you to ask me questions about it then, when we've done more work on it. All right, how are we doing on time? We doing okay? All right. Okay, so that's me. I'm Bridget Barrett. I'm a mixed methods political communication researcher. I have a background in programmatic media buying. My research has centered on the intersection of digital marketing and electoral politics. And moving forward, what you'll see from me is more work on political identity, branding, consumerism, and cultural consensus analysis. If you have not got a chance to look at my CV, there is a QR code here that you can scan to see it. Yeah, thank you. All right, questions? Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I have two questions. The first is theoretical question. I think it's pretty interesting when thinking together with your second study, the Barrett study, and your concluding section, the political consumerism section. Do you think political consumerism is also one of the instrumental effects of the political advertising conducted by the company or led by the parties?
Yeah, that's such a fun question. So what was your name?
Ibin.
Ibin?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And you're a PhD student, is that
Yes.
right? Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I do think you could think of like these as instrumental effects. We did not include merch sales in our experimental conditions, right? But just as you said, we all know that folks use these products as a way to either get you to give your data or as a way to get money from you. So my response would be that I think these selling merch by these political committees, that is just a way of getting data or fundraising. So in that sense, like, yes, it's definitely an instrumental effect. That's a great clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh.
Yeah, Katie?
Did you have a second question?
Oh yeah, I have one. Thank you. Second question is a very simple clarification question. Can we go back to the PCA results
Yes.
of the second study?
Oh boy, okay, yes, I should not have been doing it this way. This was, okay, there we go.
Yeah, I am curious what's the last row of the of this table. What does the percentage mean?
Yes, so this is the percent of variance explained by each component. So if it's looking at these questions, and this is how much of the variance is explained, this is pretty high because it's a very low number of questions, if that makes sense. So a lot of the time when you run PCAs, you have other things that are, that you might either leave out of components or won't land somewhere. But this one was unique in that it's pretty darn high.
Thank you.
Yes.
And this is all the different persuasion outcomes.
Yes, okay, great call on that. So we had to leave turnout out. And that's because when we fielded this, it was during COVID, and so many people had already voted that we couldn't include turnout as a measurement there. And this was a problem that we had in here.
But it's just everything else just is in there as so all the things that you were testing for. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Just
okay.
the instrumental ones though, right?
Yes, these instrumental and persuasive outcomes, but there should be turnout in here, but we couldn't include it because we had to drop too many people because too many people had already
So it's
voted.
it's actually both the instrumental and the persuasive outcomes, right? Just
Yes.
Distinguishing between
Yeah.
Distinguishing between the two,
Yeah.
yes, I'm sorry, yeah.
Thanks, sorry.
Yeah, Katie.
Actually, as I was looking at that
Oh,
table, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I was thinking about this, I'm like, when you're donating, they're also collecting.
They are, yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, that donate is actually not super high, but float's kind of high on component two, so, it's,
yeah.
I wanted to ask though, so last I checked in, with this area about this whole move towards like these tech companies embedding their employees in the political campaigns.
Yeah.
Which seems wild, right?
Mhm.
Read Dan Crease's book, and I've not paid attention since.
Okay, great, love it.
I am, so basically
Yeah.
we've had like a decade and a half now of things that have changed. So can you contextualize your work? Now, I know that this is on older data,
Mm-hmm.
but can you contextualize this a little bit more with like, kind of for those of us that have put our heads in the sand a bit about some of this, because it's kind of upsetting. Like, what is going on with these tech companies putting employees in these spaces? What does it mean? What are the implications? And I mean, scholarly, but to help us all understand why this work's important.
Yeah. So you're asking like, what in this day and age in 2025, how is this happening?
What's up with this?
Yeah, so one of the things that I will say is that like these it's hard to study these companies, right? And partly because once people start studying them, they stop talking about things. So we do know that there's still movement between the companies and political campaigns. You still have folks who worked from one going and working for the other. And that's the same in political consulting in lots of different advertising and media industries, right? It's that like you're moving between them. When you think about it from a job perspective, when you work on a campaign, that campaign ends and you do not have a job anymore. So this isn't a bad thing, this is just the fact of how this works. Unless you're kept on as a full-time staffer, you need a job somewhere else, and maybe you work somewhere where then when a campaign starts again, you can go and work back to that campaign. So you're always going to have these trading of people from consultancies and campaigns and tech companies and media agencies, and ad sales firms as well, because by the nature of working for a campaign, you need a job and you're going to get it in there. So this still does happen. I don't think we're going to see as good of reporting or as good of studies on anything like this moving forward because companies just aren't going to talk to people about it as much. So for those who don't know, Daniel Crease's book, one thing that he did was like LinkedIn network analysis. So we looked at everyone's job histories on LinkedIn. Also trying to scrape data from different company web pages, like just if that is allowed or not has become extremely contentious too. So different companies are kind of locking down your ability to collect that data, although you can still do it by hand. So if you ever want to do LinkedIn job history, you're totally fine to go and do that by hand. You just aren't supposed to scrape that data anymore.
So just my basic understanding is like early social media ad days. Facebook would go in and be like, look, you all don't really know how to optimize your ads. It's our company. We're gonna work together so you can like do this properly because it's like a new thing. Okay. And then you fast forward, you assume that like there are lots more people that know how these ads work. Like you don't need somebody from Facebook or Google necessarily to like optimize your ads because like there's a whole industry of people like your former job that like know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, like, what does it mean that representatives of these companies are there? As you make a great point, that like then it impacts the norms in terms of just like the features of some of these ads, but also on like what is expected, etc. But like, is there then an expectation later that like, like you look at like Zuckerberg and Trump right now?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on that Meta's changing all its policies now? That Zuckerberg's become best friends with Trump? Like, there's a lot of weirdness going on. So in terms of like implications about that sort of stuff, where does that kind of sit within the social network analyses that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, so I think bigger picture, like what is the role of the media during de-democratization? Great question. Would love to have more answers to that. But I do think like one thing that I can speak to and that I've written about as well, when you have when you have these really close relationships with these big spenders and these big campaigns, that's going to advantage those big spenders and those big campaigns. They're going to know when the new features are going to be rolling out, right? And if you don't have one of these as tight of relationships, you're not going to know that. They're going to get heads up on things like identity verification. that not everyone knew that was coming when Facebook, in case you didn't know, used to be on Facebook, all you needed to start buying political ads was a payment system to give them money. And that, that's the whole oh, you could pay in rubles, right? It was literally any way that you could give them money. They're like, great, run some ads. And then later, after we figured out that maybe that isn't a great system, they started doing identity verification. So you'd have to submit a picture of your ID, where you live, what company you work for, things like that. And so some people knew that was coming and some people didn't. So some people who were trying to run ads, just everything fell apart, and other people were ready to go. So you do have these issues of fairness in here too, that ends up privileging the people with the closer relationships to these companies. And I'm sorry that doesn't answer your bigger question.
This is really interesting.
Okay.
It is upsetting though.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so I want to ask you the ethics question. I'm sure you're ready for it, but because that's kind of what it is. But my particular spin on it is, as communication scholars, we're educating the next generation of, folks who are then doing the work that we study.
Right.
And that we have different feelings about, what they're doing to our world.
Yeah.
We're producing the people who are doing these things.
Right.
So how do you position your sort of research agenda in an ethical framework, and how do you position your teaching in an ethical framework? As a sort of communication scholar who's producing the future of political advertising.
Ooh, wow. I like that. Can I take that? And I'm a political communication researcher who's producing the future of political advertising. So in my teaching, I do teach very advertising kind of skillsy, like media planning and buying classes right now. And teaching that is really interesting because that folks are going to face these ethical, I faced ethical issues, right? I had problems. And what we can do is kind of give them the tools to understand that those are happening, especially thinking when you're first out of a job, giving people the critical thinking skills to be that is a weird thing to ask of me. Or this is something that I might not be comfortable doing, and here are the reasons why. Giving folks the language to talk about that. But then also from my perspective as someone right now who's teaching in these advertising classes, it's also making sure that the curriculum elsewhere includes other things too. I can do some pieces of it. I make all my students learn about the racial history of advertising research and the ways that non-white people were left out to make sure that when they do this kind of research in the future, they are not just centering whiteness automatically as their audience. And in the political space, again, kind of being able to point out when you're making a choice that Willie Horton ad, do folks know the Willie Horton ad? This is a classic example of putting a scary black face and talking about and connecting this scary black criminal to a political candidate, and in a way that was very much just choosing this person because they were black. And you think oh, Willie Horton ad, so old. In 2022, Christine Drazen in Oregon did the exact same thing. And so being able to show students, here it was then and here it is now, this is not over, folks are still doing this. So those are some of the ways that I try to capture the ethics, but then there's also just bigger data privacy questions too that we have to dig into for what is acceptable here. Sorry, that was a bit rambly. Did that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up, Willie Horton, having taught our class, our political communication class, from an old perspective, I was in the business, I've been here over 30 years, but I'm used to, and one of the things I found, even when I was leaving and coming here in 1987, I covered the last major campaign, and mostly it felt like we were just half the time being brought in to show new ads. Everything was coming through advertising. Well, if McLuhan is right, and he's not a favorable person to quote, I know, but he was basically saying, don't look at the content of the ad, look at the nature of the communication technology. And that's really a lot of what your research would do. Now, having said that, remembering Willie Horton, I would look at, from what I've read and what I've seen, that the ad that was run against Kamala Harris in the Midwest states, where they had her on tape talking about how she supported government funding of transgender surgery for prisoners. And I would look at that ad as very much of a Willie Horton ad. It was basically, it was pure content. It was a hit ad. There was a debate among Obama and Clinton. Bill Clinton got involved in this, so whether she should respond to that ad or leave it alone, they decided not to respond. And so us old-fashioned people who look at covering political communication are still going to say, well, look, there's sophisticated stuff we've had. And some of it's been like what they did with Cambridge Analytica when it first emerged, that you could use data to really manipulate people in sophisticated ways. But the old, just throw it out, throw the red meat out there, and just see how it works. And that had to be fairly sophisticated because what they identified, and what people have written, many women voters, particularly in the far suburbs, were influenced by that idea that people who were born men but changed could involve themselves in women's sports, and then women would get pushed out because of their physical disadvantages. And that triggered actually a big part of the voting thing, but that was just classic stuff. How would you look at what you're doing and how it compares to people who are still doing classical hit pieces where the content is what's driving it rather than the medium itself?
Yeah, I think you're like, when I opened this, I said I'm going to say, like, we're going to talk about new effects, and I'm saying, like, understanding culture. It's like, isn't this understanding the picture in our heads? Isn't this where we started with public opinion research very, very long time ago? And I think this is kind of the same thing, right? Like, you're right. Like, these things are still happening, and folks are still using these same drivers that just still identity-based work, where I think there's some differences to then and now is in how our political system has changed, right? And so recognizing, like, within that context, how these things might be different or interpreted differently. I'm in Colorado, and I got those ads too, and they ran really a whole bunch for 2 weeks, and then they went off again. And that was it was an interesting strategy because it's the thing that I think I remember and that a lot of people remember, but it was actually only 2 weeks of the campaign that those were running a whole lot, and then they were off again. But those were, do people remember this ad that I was talking about here? It's a very memorable ad. If you haven't seen it, yeah, look at it, because it's very...
Willie Horton?
No, sorry, you're the Kamala Harris.
Yeah, that ad.
Yeah, that ad.
You could go back to the Daisy ad, with Johnson and the nuclear.
Yeah.
And it only ran at one time, and it served its purpose. And I'm asking that because I'm actually going to teach that class this summer.
Okay.
And I'm trying to figure out, in my own thinking, Cambridge Analytica, that was a big deal. They got ahead of the game. Now everybody knows it's caught up. That's how they sort of go campaign to campaign. Remember when Obama was ahead of the game? And then we learned that no, Steve Bannon had done this other stuff. Trying to figure out how to tease out those old-fashioned and still important strategies, hit advertising, all that, combined with the new
tactics.
What's happening.
Yeah.
And I'd love your opinion. Get a paper out on that.
Thank you.
Something like that.
Wonderful. We are at, I don't know, are we still going? We got more time. Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, I got mixed up. Yes. Oh.
Wonderful, super cool stuff. Your study that used the qualitative textual analysis.
Yeah.
I was curious because after that study you talked about social identity theory.
Yes.
I'm curious if you see social identity working with those commercials. Like, do you see a connection between the messaging that we're seeing in those commercials and social identity theory and like how we understand in-groups and out-groups and how they're managing to include and exclude individuals?
Yes. So the in-group, out-group appeals around race, I think, are the biggest example of social identity appearing there, and thinking about social identity theory in terms of the political identities, right? For the Republican women, it's about the in-group appeals of white and Christian, and then the out-groups of Black or atheist or Cori Bush, even though she has nothing to do with anything going on here. So absolutely. We don't talk about that a ton in the framework for that paper, but it is extremely present, and that is a big part of what we're interested in. Yeah, Leah?
Sort of follow up on that.
Yeah.
Other thing, the theory that you were talking about was authenticity. I'm just wondering, with respect to authenticity, are you seeing like the appeals that are being used in the Democratic ads identify a way of authentically being a woman for that constituency? Again, assuming that we really are polarized and these ads aren't trying to get people to change parties, they're just trying to sort of get out the vote, and that there's a kind of authenticity for Republican women that's different from the authenticity for
we got some really good reviews on this. It's nice when the review process, you feel like it's really doing what it's supposed to do, and that's the case on this one, where it feels like the review process is doing what it's supposed to do. And part of that is also pushing on this like what are the Democrat women identities, and these. And so there are two things about this. The first is that we do it in more of a comparative way of just saying like they are using more options, right? That they're seeing more options here. And the second is that this is why I want better definitions of what these identities are and what the content of them is. Because it is exceptionally difficult to write about these things using some of the language and comparisons that exist in the literature, right? I don't have anywhere to point to contouring to say that is like connected to Republican traditions of what femininity is, right? That's a very hard thing to point to. And so with the women on the Democratic side, like they're definitely still restrained by their party. We don't see women out there toting guns, right? Like they are following what is allowed in their party. It just so happens that is a broader range of actions than is necessarily there in the Republican Party. Does that make sense? All right, you're gonna talk to me more about this later. Yeah, okay, yes.
Okay, I'll be quick. My question is very simple and straightforward. What courses do you see yourself teaching in the next 2 years?
Yeah, so I would love to teach classes around political advertising, political communication. That would make me very happy to do those. I would also be happy to, now and again, teach classes more connected to professions in the communication, in communications. So maybe resurrecting some of the courses that haven't been taught in a little while around here about professions in communication. And yeah, political advertising. I think that's what I would really like to be teaching. Yes. And what was your name again?
Russell.
Russell. Okay.
Okay, so I have a question about the future work that you want to do,
Yeah.
And especially around cultural competency. So I like the idea in relation to social identity theory, because I think like it's often taken for granted that people recognize this like social identity that they're like conforming to or like rejecting. But it gives me anxiety to treat it social through like a social scientific lens.
Okay.
And so my question is like conceptually, how do you distinguish, or how do you plan on distinguishing cultural competency from like just recognizing party platform or other affiliated concepts? And then like methodologically, it seems like culture, it's kind of hard to disentangle like causality, right?
Yes.
Because so you have like political ads and you have the culture that is maybe informing what's in the content of the ads, but also so the parties hope being driven by the ads. So also how do you plan on like actually deciding like which is influencing which?
Oh yeah, no, we are not getting to causality yet. Oh, that's a much future problem. But no, I agree with you on, well, first of all, I hear your anxiety. And the idea of like this cultural competency is just like recognizing party platforms. I do think that's part of it though, right? Like, so from a branding perspective, if we we take branding as like party actors are trying to create a brand, and that has a brand identity to these party actors, and they're hoping that people recognize that brand identity is communicated in the branding literature. There's brand identity and there's brand image. And brand identity is like the internal thing that they're trying to construct, and brand image is what is it interpreted as. So I see this as extremely similar to social identity theory's prototype, right? That these come from different traditions, but they're both getting at a similar thing. And what I like about branding is that it does exactly what you acknowledge. It says that people are trying to control this, that this is something that people are working to create and make and communicate. This is part of a strategic communication campaign. And so if it's just people recognizing party platform, that's fine. That's the goal in a lot of ways, is to mean that this is what a Democrat is these things on our party platform, and that is the cultural construct. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess just my question then would be like, why not just call it like platform recognition, right? Because like I think like cultural competency involves like so much more, right? Like, how does a person identify like what it means to be a Democrat for themselves is different than the party platform.
So we don't know if it's going to be the party platform, right? We don't know that. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think that's what people think of when they think of Democrat or conservative. So that's part of why I'm interested in it, is that I think it's going to be other things. One of the ways that I first started thinking about this, well, there's a couple. There was one of my brothers identifying as a neoliberal when I asked him like how he identified politically, and being like, well, what's going on there? And then the other, when I was thinking about like what it means to be a good Democrat, and I started wondering if that means donating money, if that has become part of what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican. And so those are things that may or may not show up in party platforms. Does it? Yeah, those like we don't quite know what people, especially people who aren't super involved in politics, think of these things. Okay, I saw Valerie's hand first.
Just had lots of questions around this as well. So especially from social identity theory and the kind idea of sort of the prototype is more from looking out in. So I'm going to have a more clear sense of what I think the contemporary GOP is, or within that, MAGA voters within the GOP. Much more complex view of what the Democrats are, not just because we are more complex, but because we know our own group and it's variability more.
Yes, we accept more variability.
I have two questions, two-ish, three questions, but they're short. So why are you expecting one identity to come out? Or are you just looking across all of the myriad definitions? Are there some core components that everybody says? Why use those labels, Democrat and Republican? Are you not going to?
That question.
What about independence?
Yeah. Okay. All great questions. So as I've been planning how to do this study, the first thing that I'll say is that no, I do not think there's going to be one definition. Absolutely not. I do not think that we have in the cultural consensus language. I do not think there is consensus. I was explaining to someone one of the pieces that also inspired this project is by Hakeem Jefferson at Stanford, and he showed in a great paper how Black Americans' understanding of what is conservative is not what we think conservative means from like the scholarly perspective. So when you're asking how liberal to conservative are you, they are answering that on a wildly different meaning than what we thought that it meant. This is just an incredible groundbreaking paper showing this kind of overlap in identity and those differences being drawn out. So that's what I think is going on with political identities as well. That when someone says Democrat, that just means wildly different things to different people. And to be able to spell that out and just say that, like there is not consensus, might not be surprising, but then to be able to dig into a little bit about where these differences are and come from. That's more of what I expect to come out of this project. In terms of why choose these labels, I'm going to use Democrat and Republican because I think it's like the lower hanging fruit that is feasible to work on. I am very interested in how people self-identify their politics, like my brother saying that he's a neoliberal. in part because on the right you do have conservative, and this is fairly accepted. There's Francesca Tripodi's book, The Propagandist Playbook, makes a really nice argument of what conservative means using what she calls the 5 F's of freedom, firearms, family, armed forces, and faith, and talking through those. While on the left, we do not have great literature saying what does it mean to be a liberal, and if people even identify as liberal. Most of the people who I talk to who are very involved in politics use the term progressive.
And you're talking only about self-identification, not, so the consensus is within, not across.
Yeah, so what I would look for is if there's consensus within group members. I still want to ask the question for out group members too, because that is still saying like there's difference between these groups and what these things are. But yeah, so I'd be more interested in like if even in group members agree on this. Yeah.
So it's kind of follow up the same kind of issue. It's more like theoretical. So when you say consensus,
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of the question you're going to ask? What kind of thing that would, are you going to ask their opinion on a certain topic? Are you going to ask their lifestyle?
Yeah.
There's all sorts of things that you can ask.
Yeah.
So could you give me an example? And I would just say another question related to this is, what do you think about the possibility that there is no essence of this group?
Yeah, I love that answer.
Maybe there is no need for a concrete, thing to behind a specific social group. It's just that people wanted to have like-minded people and connect with them and use whatever cues or topics or behavior stuff at that point as signals. So yeah.
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that. I'm going to answer the second question first while it's in my head. Why do we care? Why does it matter? From social identity theory, we know that people conform to their group. So what is the group? If we know that you can trigger people to conform to something, then shouldn't we know what it is that we think they're going to conform to? Because right now that is still very flimsy in a lot of this literature. We make a lot of assumptions about what it is. We have a lot of beliefs about what it is that come from us and our understanding, but we don't very often measure what that is to the people that we are interested in. So that's the first thing. If we were going to make predictions about people conforming to the group prototype, I would love to know what the group prototype is. That would be really helpful. And then your other question was about what are these things. So it might end up being policy questions, like Russell said. This is in, if you ask folks who aren't Francesca Tripodi what conservative is, it's about the size of government. I don't think that's what conservative is. So this is where the deep qualitative work comes in first, of doing interviews to try to figure out what people are putting on this to begin with. And then what you're talking about, what does get difficult is that this cultural consensus analysis, you can make it work with different question types. You end up doing more PCA analysis, more principal component analysis. But what you really want to be able to do is get scaled questions that might become about like how important is this thing to this group.
Yeah, I just want to add comments on this. Is just I still feel that the actual content of what people believe, the actual consensus might still be bounded within a local community, and it may be different across local communities, because I do believe that whether we should believe there is an essence of a political group is a question. It's a question.
Yeah, it's a question. Love the question. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry. So I have two very different questions about methodology. So the first one is you mentioned that in the SOUP study, that it was sort of underpowered to find an effect in terms of the outcomes there. Do you have a sense of how big an effect it would need to be for you to be able to detect it? And do you have a sense of how, presumably, at least for some of these things, maybe not the persuasive ones, we actually know what the effects likely are, right, from previous work as well. And so you know how big your sample was relative to that. So I guess that's, my question is like, how big an effect would you have needed to find for there? And there's a little bit of a funny thing, because you don't know, because you probably do know the expected effect sizes for some of them, but not for
So this,
right?
so this was part of our problem. I don't think I put the power analyses in the appendix.
Number, the question is like, do you know that, and do you have a sense of what it is?
So on the persuasive effects, you're usually looking at like the studies that are able to identify effects are looking at in the thousands and thousands, often 10,000 or more of exposures of things. So just very, very large.
10,000 exposures to see any effect at all?
To get an effect at field experiments, yes. Yeah. We're looking at massive exposures. In experimental work, I think the last one on swayable, the only minimal effects that they found, I think they had in the 5,000 range of responses. But the whole outcomes of all of this literature is that you're looking for very small effect sizes on these outcomes. So I would need to go back and look at these. And then on the instrumental effects, we just didn't have anything to work with. It was only 871 people. In political ad effects, it's just you expect them to be very small. Which makes it expensive.
I mean, I'd be curious. I mean, I understand you haven't done this, but there's like the post hoc power analysis where you could say, like, we could have did that. You can at least bound the effect. You can say that, like, given a sample of that big, if the effect had been at least this big, you would have been likely to find it. Right?
I might be able to find that in a response letter to a reviewer. I know that somebody asked. I think we did it, but I do not remember the answer you're looking for.
Cool. Okay. So the other question is different, which is in terms of the governor race study. What do you think is different about having two women running against each other? Right. So this is a question about you chose this example. And I agree it's unusual. But what is the idea that women, if it's two women, they're not going to be sort of forced to conform to certain kinds of gender stereotypes, or is the idea that they're going to be more forced because now they're competing with another woman to have to do it, right? What? And so I guess this is what is this why did you choose that example, and what analytic angle does that give you, and how should we interpret these results relative to, I don't know, all of the other times where there's one woman running against a man, presumably?
Right. Yeah. This is a great question. There's very little expectations that we were able to draw from the literature on what's going to be different. The one thing that we knew to look at is that there's evidence that in campaigns, when it's a man versus a woman will often focus on more masculine issues, which we have lots of problems with masculine issues, and also portray more masculine traits, which again, lots of issues around masculine traits, like leadership, masculine traits. Okay, cool, she's an incumbent, she's been doing this for 4 years, is this so masculine? And so what some research has shown is that women will run on more masculine traits until her male opponent takes on feminine traits or feminine issues, and then she has to switch. That when he tries to pull women away, that's when women candidates have to conform to this more gendered expectation to kind of protect their home base, if you will. So the major prediction that we had is that they wouldn't have to do that. But in terms of when a woman is running against a woman for an executive position, there was just so little in the literature of what we're going to expect to see, both because we haven't seen it before and mostly because we haven't seen it before. So our expectation is that they wouldn't have to run as women, right? That was the major expectation going into it, but that was a pretty limited conclusion to draw.
Yeah, I don't know what the state of the paper is, but I'm curious as to, and this is maybe this is just a thing I'm curious about. You didn't do, so maybe you don't have an answer. But I'm curious about how that would compare to, I don't know, let's say previous elections in that state, or maybe even in neighboring or similar states in which there was a woman running against, I don't know how many other, states had different ones, right? But like the comparison, it seems like to answer that question,
Yes.
don't you need
You need a comparison group,
to,
yeah.
to the other ones as well? If the goal is to understand what's different,
Yeah.
then you've selected on the dependent variable,
Yes,
right?
we
Like,
did.
yeah.
Yes. This is a problem with it from the start, right? Which is that we, on one hand, we're like, this is a new thing that we want to look closely at and see what we can see and see what we can learn. And then the issue with that is that if we were to try to do it a different way, if we were to try to not select on the dependent variable, we would need to look at similar states with men running in 2022. Try to draw comparisons there. At that point, we're getting out of a sample size for textual analysis to territory, and we're starting to get into quantitative methods, which we didn't want to deal with. So that is absolutely, no matter how we parse it, just a theoretical limitation of the study and what we can say, and a call for future research, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes.
I guess building off of that, I don't know if this is too far off the tangent, but would it be worth looking at if the women who ran against women, if any of them had ever ran against a man previously?
Yeah.
And then use that as a comparison?
I love that. Do it.
Yeah.
Sorry. We've got so many great research ideas. Let's go. I think that would be a great way to go about it. I like this paper. We got some major revisions. We have a lot to work on in it. I'm very appreciative of the time from the reviewers to dig into it. And hopefully when the final product comes out, it will inspire people to go and do more things even better than what we did. Yeah, Christine.
So kind of staying on that study of the women governor candidates, I would just like to hear you talk a little bit. I was inspired by your conversation with Russell earlier about like branding versus, branding versus sort of more of a content, do people identify with the platform of their party and so on? And it just seems to me that your examples when you're pointing to like the pearls or the contouring, that sort of thing, especially obviously in these platforms that are so driven by memes and aesthetic and vibe, right? And so it seems to me, on the Republican side, and I feel like looking at women is a really, it's the most sharp relief, I think, looking at women right now in politics, because of course there's this really cultivated Trump world white female aesthetic, with the long extended barrel curls and the contouring and the Botox and all of that, right?
Fox News feminism.
And the Fox News look, and I feel like it's not just performing a traditional sort of white femininity, it's also showcasing the effort, like knowing that there's Botox there, knowing that there's extensions, that's part of it. It's not like they're trying to look just naturally glamorous, I woke up this way. It's like the effort to punctuate and amplify yourself as a woman is the point. And then the artifice is the point.
Yeah.
And it's just a very interesting, and so I feel like there's that performance in these platforms, especially for so-called low information voters that really do just sort of like vibe with something or they like an aesthetic. That's gonna be like, which is all just to say, you're looking at it through a lens of branding, I think really works for that, right? Because for so many people, unfortunately, that's where they're finding the like, oh, that's the tribe I wanna be affiliated with. And of course there's versions of that on the left, right? That it's like, but it's not the same. I think it's just interesting to look at, the branding lens makes sense to me.
Okay, well, I'm glad. Yeah.
This is a very provincial, short question. We had 4 places of study in the wisdom of the university back in the 1990s. They eliminated advertising, broadcast, and public relations. For us, we were just left with journalism. We brought back some of those because technology has changed enough that we can bring back. For example, we kind of brought back our version of public relations, and we, of course, incorporated a lot of visuals and things that tie in. You look like you're a pretty lonely person in Colorado, and you're teaching advertising classes. We don't have any advertising classes. What is it that makes you would like to come here And also Colorado had this trauma, that had some really heavy-duty stuff in their reorganization. Why do you want to come here to us when we have no advertising program, and at least you can teach a class in advertising?
Yeah, I want to come here because I don't necessarily want to be a professor of advertising.
That's what I wanted to hear.
I would like to be a professor of political communication. That would fit much better with where I publish and the conferences that I go to. I do love advertising. That was my professional experience. I still want to keep studying it, but I don't want it to become a limiting factor of what I do. And that's what I'm a little bit nervous about happening if I stay somewhere where I am a professor of advertising. So, yeah.
And on that bright note, we will give Dr. Bridget Barrett a great round of applause.